Hey y'all, Matt here, and today we're going to dive into something in the Old Testament that is really weird when we read it, especially more so in our culture. When we read Genesis 16 verse 3, where it talks about Abraham getting his wife's slave as a surrogate mother, and then again we see it later on in Genesis 30 verse 3, when Rachel actually gives her slave to Jacob, and then his other wife, dealing with polygamy here too, Leah gives Jacob her slave as a surrogate mother as well. And we'll talk about polygamy in the Bible in another video. We see it a lot in the Old Testament, but that's for the next video. But today we're going to talk about this practice that we see in Genesis, of basically giving the wife giving their slave to their husband as a surrogate mother. And when we read this, it's really, really weird. And we're kind of like, what? The Bible allows this? And the number one thing that we need to keep in mind is just because we see people in the Old Testament or in scriptures doing something, that doesn't always mean that, like, the Bible is saying that that's a condoned practice, that it's something that we should do or that we can do, that it's not a sin. Obviously, Scripture defines marriage as between a man and a woman, and the practice of giving another wife to your husband or anything like this, anything outside of that, is obviously sin. It's outside of the scope of what God created marriage to be. But in the Old Testament, this was a practice that was actually something that we see very commonly. They had a very limited understanding of, they didn't have science like we did. They had a very limited understanding of how reproduction worked. And so oftentimes if a woman was barren, the way that they would obtain a kid or a child would be to give the husband their slave as like a surrogate mother. And in this culture, you have to remember, it was very much driven by the continuation of the lineage. It was a patriarchal society. So it was very, very important that we see that a wife give a husband a male child, because that's the heir. Without an heir, their lineage dies. They can't inherit anything. Women aren't allowed to continue on the name or inherit property or anything like that. And as they all got older, they would also rely on this male heir to care for them and to take over the house, to basically house them, and because they didn't have nursing homes either. And so this is why we see, especially in Genesis, in these two passages, both of them, we see that the practice, it gives them this child that they desired. It gives the man an heir to continue on his line, to inherit all their property. But it also causes problems between these slaves and the actual wife of this man once they're given child, because there's animosity between them. The actual wife sees that they couldn't be the one that gave their husband the child, and the slave did. And so even though they obtained their child through those means, there was a lot of animosity there because they couldn't do it themselves. Another thing about this culture is they didn't really deal with like bloodlines and genetics like we do. So this child that the slave or the surrogate mother would give them, it would be treated as though it was that woman's actual child. So they would basically take that kid as their own and welcome it into their family. But I hope this has cleared it up a little bit. Most of the time when we see weird things in the scriptures, a lot of times it's a cultural issue. It's a problem with us and not a problem with the Bible. And we just have to put a little work into it to understand it. But until the next video when we talk about polygamy, I love you guys. Blessings.